This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
So we're segueing back into, sort of late spring, early summer. And I have some different serial killers coming up. But I thought I would segue this, in terms of true crime stuff, I thought I would segue back into those killers with some cases that I never really get a chance to cover. And I've done a little research on over time. Today it's sort of an old piece of true crime news I wanted to talk about that dovetails into one of these killers. Have you heard of a guy? He's out of North Carolina. His name is Jonathan Hayes.
Jonathan Hayes.
He's a nurse out of Wake Forest Baptist Hospital who is now suspected that he might be a serial killer.
Yes. Did he come into the news like last year or the year before?
Yeah. So he starts making the news when he gets arrested in October of 2022.
Okay. Yeah, I remember that.
I thought his stuff is kind of interesting. We have to tread carefully with these guys because I don't know where he's at in the process. And I just wanted to bring him up today because I wanted to talk about something kind of similar to that. He pops in the news and he kind of stays in the news for a solid year. And I had read a couple of different things about him. Buffalo News had a story on him. And obviously, there was some local news in North Carolina, WXII, the Winston-Salem Journal. Fox 8 had a couple of little blurbs about him. And then as you kind of branch out from there, some of the other news outlets in North Carolina, including WTVD, they're all sort of in here. Behind the headlines, they ran a story on him. WRAL contributed to what we're looking at. I pulled up a specific article to talk about him for a second because I thought it was an interesting article. But Jonathan Hayes, he was 47 years old at the time of this article. The article's out at WXII, and it just says, "I love my mama. I miss her so much," in quotes. Then it says, "Daughter wants justice after former triad nurse gave lethal doses of insulin to patients." This is by a reporter named Louis Tran over there. And it's pretty simple. It says a daughter is urging for justice after her mother's death. One of the victims, former triad nurse, is accused of killing after administering lethal doses of insulin. On Wednesday, Jonathan Hayes, who's 47, a former nurse with Atrium Health Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center, and that is a mouthful to say, the hospital, appeared in court for his first court hearing at the Forsyth County District Court at 9:30 a.m. The judge said that Hayes faces a possibility of life in jail or the death penalty for each of the 2 counts of murder he faces and a possibility of 472 months in jail for attempted murder. These are related to the deaths of Gwen Crawford on January 5th, 2021, and Vicky Lingerfelt on January 22nd. I'm not sure if they mean 2021 or 2022 there. And then he administered a near-fatal dose to a third patient on December 1st of 2021. And that's coming out of the Forsyth County District Attorney's Office. The DA at the time was a guy named Jim O'Neill. So this is a serial killer who's acting alone. Well, this is a possible serial killer who's acting alone. He didn't know these patients personally. He's going about this in like a very odd way, but like I tend to stay away from these types of killers in terms of research. I have a lot of ties in North Carolina, so that was one of the reasons that like he caught my attention in the first place. I don't know what I was reading, but I'm sure it was something else local news wise.
Right. And so I agree about staying away from them, sort of. He's certainly, in my opinion, my opinion only. He is not a serial killer. From what I remember about his case, he is a overworked, underperforming medical, I would say professional, if he was performing like he should be, a nurse, right?
Yeah.
He's an overworked, underperforming nurse, and there may have been some control motivation or something, but honestly, if I recall correctly, I remember reading what had come out and then later what more had come out, right?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, well, this guy was just, I felt a little bit sorry for him because it seemed like he was super overworked or really stupid because of his choices, the choices that he was making as far as because I believe that he overdosed them on insulin, right?
Yeah, two people.
But it wasn't by slight amounts. It was by like a huge amount.
It looks like it's a huge amount, yeah.
Right. And so there was nothing about what he did that said, I'm trying to kill these people and not get caught.
I gotcha.
Okay. And so the other thing, my understanding was that it was such a huge amount. There was no way that he could have thought that he was giving them the therapeutic dose that was necessary. Right.
Yeah.
So what's happening there? Well, because it is something, because if you just slightly overdose someone, right, that's one thing. That's sneaky, right? That's like trying to get away with something, trying to have power to end their life, but also continue your life. But when you do like a whole bunch of it, that's going to show up as an anomaly, well, what's happening there? I think he was just being sort of reckless.
I wasn't sure how you felt about people who did things like that. So I brought him up, and I've been watching his case. I've noticed that it is dragging. Like, it's going to be a while before we actually see any kind of resolution.
More than likely, he's not a serial killer unless I hear some pretty significant other details, but more than likely, he will probably, well, actually, I don't know. I think the reason it's taking so long is because of the sort of nuances of the case. I don't know if you saw, but like basically his whole side of the story, according to what was released eventually, was basically that he had actually marked the patient's records with exactly what he was doing.
Interesting.
And when they ask him questions sort of I don't know that he was in custody yet or whatever, like, for example, they're like, it was interesting because Jonathan Hayes explained to investigators that some of the things that he did that appeared to be haphazard in his practices, and they pointed out violated the policies of the hospital. He said that he was doing them simply to save time based on his workload. Right. So there's nothing sinister about that. I mean, clearly he's not following the rules, which that should result in him not having the job if he can't learn how to follow the rules. Right.
Yeah.
But when he was told that Gwen Crawford was given 100 dosage units of insulin, he said to the investigators, that is a lot of insulin that someone would have had to have administered intentionally. And they're like, well, you did it. And he's like, well, I don't think so. But if the Baptist Hospital Risk Management said that I did it, I guess I did it, like according to their records.
Right.
So see, that's not somebody that, that would be an incredibly manipulative sociopath right there, right? If he was saying, well, I don't remember doing it, but I guess I did it, if that's what they say. Don't you think?
Yeah, I do. I definitely do.
Because usually you see denial, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, wow, if I did that, that was really wrong. But he's saying, like, I don't think I did that, but if that's what the records say, I had to have done it. And then he's just sort of like, okay. It's a really strange dynamic to have. And that's where all that information, plus like a little more that was still that same type of back and forth, is what led me to think that like his brain was fried and he wasn't paying attention to what he was doing. I don't know how they could have tracked that. I've seen various hospitals where like they have systems in place where codes are used that would indicate at least some sort of tracking on medication. Now, how they make sure that like 100 dosage units of insulin went from wherever it was stored into this one particular patient, I feel like that could be hard to track, right?
Yeah.
But they're saying that it tracked, right? And so whatever they use, I assume they've tested the legitimacy and accuracy of it. And if that's the case, the whole reason for that would be to prevent this type of thing from happening, but it didn't prevent it. He did it, right?
Right.
And so when you look at something like that, I mean, why even try? There's so many other things if he wanted to be like this sinister serial killer that he could do sort of on the down low and turn around and deny it. But this, it's like very open, right?
Yeah. So we have talked about a lot of different types of killers. We've talked about sort of the up close and personal sexual homicide killer. We've talked more recently, we've gone over these different situations where we have a lot of anger killers. We've talked about sort of these spree killers that cross over into the serial killer space. Jonathan Hayes was interesting to me for a number of reasons. And I went down this rabbit hole, and I don't know if you've ever been down this rabbit hole before, where there are categories, Murderpedia, Wikipedia, all those places have categories of killers who are medical professionals or pretending to be medical professionals. Have you ever looked at those type cases?
People pretending to be medical professionals.
Yeah, because I think all of them fall under that if they're a medical professional who's taken an oath but is killing. But yeah, like people who are doing like pseudo, I don't know how to explain it. Like it's kind of like they're selling snake oil that kills people.
Right. Well, and so you asked me that, and the reason I had to clarify was because I believe that there's people who are medical professionals that aren't doing their job appropriately, but then there are actually people that are not, and they're like, "I'm a doctor, come see me," and all the implications that come with that type of setup. And yes, I look into those anytime I see them because I'm so fascinated by it.
Well, I pulled up like a top 10 list here, and I pulled up a case for today, but I was struck by something in particular that was really interesting. And this is not like, I'm not going over the people that I'm talking about in these top 10 names here. I'm really curious if you come to the same kind of shock that I did. The first one I pulled up was Charles Cullen. Have you ever heard of him?
I'm not sure.
So Charles Cullen, he was a nurse in New Jersey, and he was active as a killer from 1988 to 2003. I say New Jersey, but he also kind of crosses over into Pennsylvania. He isn't admitted to his murders, but they've had trouble verifying like what he did. Now, Cullen's still alive, and he would probably make a fascinating episode once I wrap my head around him. But this is just really kind of by the numbers. He has been proven and admitted to 29 murders as a nurse. But what's interesting about him is authorities put his possible total at a conservative 400 people.
I'm skeptical about that. Any number like that, I'm very, very skeptical about it.
Well, and that's sort of why we're here and we're talking about it.
So one thing to consider, and this is for everybody to consider, typically in situations where medical professionals have gone awry, gone rogue, whatever you want to say, there has been one incident, right? And that incident is being looked into and more than likely pressed by a family member of someone who died unexpectedly. Would you say that's fair to say?
Yeah, like something has happened here and they want to know what happened. Yeah.
So they start looking into it, right?
Correct.
And then depending on the amount of pressure that the organization, like the hospital or medical center, is getting, depending on the pressure they get from the family, that in turn would reflect on the pressure that the medical center puts on the investigators, right?
Yeah.
And, it's like dominoes. And as that's happening and they start looking more and more into things, sometimes, and I'm not saying that's necessarily true for Charles Cullen, but if you start looking through somebody's record, so to speak, you can find all kinds of just human error mistakes, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and up until the point that the family member was disappointed in the unexpected death of their loved one and pushed it with the hospital, who in turn turned it over to law enforcement, as they should do if there's actually something happening there.
Right.
Law enforcement then investigates it. But see, I don't know if people sort of readily know this or not, but sometimes, and I don't know about this particular area, sometimes when investigators are using resources for something, like a person dying in the care of a medical professional at a facility, they've got to make it worth the resources they're using. And sometimes human mistakes that were made years earlier suddenly become crimes. And crimes that, are they crimes? Well, we have no idea, because they would have never come to light but for this other incident, right?
Right.
And so when stuff like that happens, I'm not sure if everybody completely follows the sort of circle of life there in this type of investigation, but I don't think it's odd that people would have their patients, especially if they're in like hospice or like rehabilitation facilities where older people go and they die while under their care.
Yeah.
If you start having all that examined, I mean, yeah, you can make a whole lot of stuff out of that. Is there anything really there? Well, I don't know, but I would say, even though I'm skeptical, if Charles Cullen really did have, 400 patients that he was responsible for their deaths, like, you're dealing with a massive problem.
Oh, I agree. And like some of these people that I'm about to name are exactly what you said for a number of reasons. Cullen, what shocked me about him is, one, he's still alive. Two, he's been in prison since 2003, give or take. I mean, he was in jail and then had to go through trial. He got hit with, I think he's got 18 life sentences that he's serving. One of the problems with his story, he's only 64 years old, by the way, which struck me. But one of the problems with his story and the stories surrounding him were, and that number, 400 plus, being a conservative possibility. I don't know how I feel about that. But there are a lot of records missing from 1988 to 2003 where Charles Cullen was practicing as a nurse. And anytime that happens, I get those same suspicions you have, and I feel like that number is just thrown out there to a degree, where it probably is like that's half of his victims, and a lot of these people died, and we're just going to tag him with this number. The second guy on my list is a guy named Niels Hogel. He's out of Germany, and from around the same time that Charles Cullen was wrapping up, let me rephrase that. So his time frame that he's operating in is from 1999 to 2005. According to German authorities, he has 85 victims and the potential for up to 300 victims, which would make him the most prolific serial killer in the history of peacetime Germany. His is a little more spot on. Now, with Charles Cullen, he did a lot of the same stuff that the Jonathan Hayes guy did. Some of that's difficult to tell, like what he was really aiming for. But with Niels Hogel, they actually moved him around the hospital and watched resuscitations and deaths spike in whatever department he was in as they were investigating him, and they actually caught him red-handed. So they were following that guy around, and he was definitely, at least to some degree, killing people.
Isn't it curious that they watched him kill people?
It is curious what was going on there for me. And so the prosecutors for his case have said there are 106 victims. Niles Hogel admits that he believes he murdered 100 patients. But how they get this number of 300 or whatever, I do not know. But this was the part that struck me that was weird. He gets adjudicated, like he is constantly going into court, like starting in about 2005 when he gets arrested. He stays in court. Like there are still court hearings related to him going on today. And that surprised me that they keep going sort of back for another bite at the apple there. But I hear this number, 300 possible victims, and it's sort of beyond me to like grasp what's going on, if that makes sense.
Right, but that also makes any given investigator's career.
It does. You're 100% right. It's a super cop situation.
And the reason that they keep going back for another bite of the apple is because of the nature of his alleged crimes, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about a family, most of the time a family has put their loved one in the care of a professional medical care facility, and dire things happen and they died. And so in the event that that's truly happening, right? Now, I think that it's referred to as like the angel of death. I don't know if you said that or not, but like that's how these like medical care professionals that end up killing their patients are often kind of coined as angels of death, because they're supposed to be helping their patients, but they end up killing them. And anytime you're looking at a situation like that, it is going to be very personal, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times, now, granted, I would say I see even if this guy is, and this would be Hogel, Niles Hogel, even if he was like the most psychopathic serial killer to have existed anywhere or whatever, I find it very odd that rather than his supervisor letting him know that he was doing something inappropriate, they moved him to a different department and let him keep doing it. And because to me, and it's probably to my detriment, but I would presume that this nurse that just injected a drug into somebody that no doctor had said to inject, and they did it at a lethal level, didn't know what they were doing.
Well, and it's one of the reasons I was bringing it up to you, is for that sort of perspective on it.
And so if he did it sinisterly, okay,
right,
there's that. But if he did it because he didn't know what he was doing and nobody told him any different, are they really surprised he did it again?
Well, that's a really good question.
And so I always look at those cases and wonder things like that. Because, I mean, if you're making burgers at your local fast food joint and you put a chicken patty on the burger bun, your supervisor comes and says, yeah, so burger patties go on burger buns, right?
Right.
Okay, it's the same thing. It's a gentle correction, right? Of course, the chicken patty situation is not a life-threatening thing, so it seems like it would be even more so important for there to be corrective action taken immediately, but that's not what it looks like happened, which maybe they felt like they were so far in that, like, what if he did kill a couple more people, which is absolutely ridiculous. I don't see where anybody was like, Oh my goodness, he used that. Now, okay, so in the event that he had gone, all these years and done the same thing that killed people and for whatever reason didn't realize it, is he really some sort of serial murderer or is he just a really bad nurse?
Well, it's funny that you bring that part up because that was where Jonathan Hayes is headed for a defense. And that is how the next person on our list is treated. So this is a guy named Frans Hugemazers. He is a Dutch nurse, or was a Dutch nurse. Now, he was known as Fat Frans, and he was nicknamed by the media the Good Samaritan. Now, he pops in 1975. That's when he's arrested. And they allege that he was active from 1970 to 1975. He's alleged to have been proven to have killed 5 people. But again, he's suspected in 259 deaths or probable homicides. But listen to what they do to him. So with him, he's arrested in 1975. Turns out his IQ is super low. They give him, for these 5 murders, when he finally gets into court, he gets 2 life terms, and he's banned from being a nurse for 20 years. So just keep that in mind for a second. The prosecutor says that he came in and he confesses to 15 murders. 15. The IQ question makes them think that maybe he shouldn't have been a nurse at all, let alone apparently he was the head nurse of his unit. And Frans retracts his confession, and he says that he's not guilty of any murder, that he actually was only to be considered guilty of administering doses without permission or in the wrong situation. And he rationalizes this by saying he would do it when the patient couldn't sleep or they were in pain, and that there were never any doctors around, so he had no idea what he was supposed to be doing. By the time this all ends up, this was the most expensive trial against any individual, and I think that stays the case until about 1990 in the Netherlands. So he gets this sentence. It's 2 life terms. He's banned from nursing. I saw it reported as 23 years, but I found it listed as 20 years, so I don't know which is true. It doesn't really matter at this point. He gets released after 18 years because his attorneys have filed this appeal in 1977. So he serves his prison sentence for about 10 more years beyond that appeal. Because he starts in 1975. They let him out in 1987. And that's for good behavior, and he's on parole for a period of time. But he's a free man. And he lives until August 20th of 2006. He passes away at 70 years old. But they let him go, the prosecution clearly stating that he had killed over 300 people. But they don't seem to believe their own number. Do you know what I mean?
I feel very confident in saying that he did not kill 300 people.
Yeah, so he pops in there, and the way they treat him, it's crazy to me that, technically, by the time he died, he could have been a nurse again. I don't think anyone would hire him, but...
I feel like once you go to jail for something like that, you probably don't want to get back into that career pool. So let me ask you this. You've just named, 4 or 5... They're all men, interestingly enough. Medical professionals who've killed, hundreds of people, apparently. Not all of them, but, you get the gist of what I'm saying. Do you think that... What do you think the likelihood is that when you're facing a situation like this, you have someone that is ill-equipped, under-trained, or undereducated versus psychotic, sociopathic serial killer?
I believe that this is done out of ignorance as opposed to
right, especially in this case with Friends. he says, and was earlier, right? He says there were never doctors around. I was doing stuff trying to help people that were in pain, right? And I believe that. I believe that he could have absolutely overdosed somebody on something by accident because he was trying to help them, right?
Yeah.
Especially if he didn't have the guidance necessary. And then, like, if he had a super low IQ, well, I mean, how low was it? What kind of competency are we actually talking about here? Is he actually even responsible for the fact that he was administering this medication without, the proper whatever, if really that should have been like hospital administration's job to get somebody in there that actually had the qualifications for it, right? This goes so much deeper than so many other things. And at the end of the day, I find it really difficult to punish people who are doing jobs that, like, they're trying their best at.
Yeah.
And they just can't do it, right? Now, okay, are they sinister serial killers? Well, I mean, that's what's out there. However, I would just like to, once again, I was going to say earlier when you started talking about France when they were like 259 supposed victims. And my question was going to be, was he on the chart in some way for 259 patients that died at some point?
That's what I think is happening.
Those numbers are from.
Yeah, that's what I think is happening.
Another thing is that that would be really unfair. It's actually kind of rare in a lot of instances for a doctor to have a patient die, especially when they're a specialized doctor that deals with issues that they have nothing to do with actually dying, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's not the same as, nurses, especially like I don't know what it would be. I guess everybody's specialized now, but like, nurses that kind of do all the care for all the patients, they could come into contact with a wide variety of patients and have, a sliding scale of involvement in their care, right?
Right.
And so I do think that technology will play, it should be already playing, but I'm not really sure to what extent it's understood, and especially with Jonathan Hayes' case. But technology in the dispensing of these these potentially lethal medications,
right?
Like when they're monitoring that stuff. I know that, like, with controlled substances, there's a log that has to be kept, and all that's computerized now. But I don't know enough about medication and like what could be used lethally. Clearly, insulin can be, right?
Right.
And if I recall correctly, you can just go buy insulin from a store, right? I mean, I guess. I don't even think you have to have a prescription for it.
There are some ways to get insulin that way, yes.
Well, I only say that because I had a dog that needed insulin. And I was able to just go to the store and buy it. So, I mean, I bought human insulin for this dog. That's what the vet told me to do. So, in that case, there is nothing that's going to stop somebody from doing that, right?
Yeah.
There's also nothing to indicate that it has to be a medical professional that does it. I'm genuinely surprised that I would be surprised if these guys had killed hundreds of people. Additionally, though, if they killed hundreds of people, like, there are so many more people to carry culpability.
That's kind of how I feel about it to a point.
And I say that because I was recently watching something on television, and a nurse, I believe this happened in Texas, but I'm not entirely sure, and it's not really the point of what we're doing. But she had given one dose of the wrong medication to one patient, and it was an accident, okay? And she ended up like losing her nursing license. Yeah. She actually had to do like some jail time or community service or something. And she was cooperative. She was remorseful. It was a huge deal. And at the end of the day, she asked the family to please forgive her. And of course they did, because it was an accident. And so it was this huge ordeal. So I find it very difficult that this, and it genuinely was just an accident. She gave the wrong medication to the wrong patient, or however it played out. There was nothing sinister about it, right?
Yeah.
And it was just a mistake that anybody could make if they had a moment where they were off. So if this goes through the entire system, how is, 300 patients dying, not going through this? I mean, why isn't that sending up any flags?
Well, you're talking about Texas, and we've only talked about one U.S. person so far, and that's Charles Cullen. So
That's true. I don't know. I can't really remember if it was Texas, but it was in the United States. I'm sure of that.
Well, I got a couple more of these for you, and I think it gets a little. So I picked these top 10 based on proven victims and possible victims, kind of with the highest numbers that I could find, because I was curious. Have you ever heard of Dr. Harold Shipman?
Yes.
I think he's a doctor. Hold on, let me make sure I'm saying that. Yeah, he's a general practitioner, and he's considered to be a serial killer. So for him, he's UK, and he was allegedly active from 1975 to 1998. He has, again, according to prosecutors in the Crown, 218 proven victims, 250 possible victims. He was convicted of 15 murders and responsible for the deaths of 218 patients identified by an inquiry, but was believed to have killed a few more. So his is not that unusual. Like they're saying 218 people he killed, 250 might be his total. What he was doing was he was injecting heroin basically into his patients, but then he was falsifying the medical records and reporting that some perfectly healthy patients had been in poor health. And then he does go through like a trial process, but ultimately the quote angel of death, that he was known as Dr. Death, or the angel of death, or the good doctor, he ends up killing himself in his jail cell. That was he was at HM Prison, Wakefield, and he hanged himself on the 13th of January, 2004, when he was 57 years old, which is kind of long after most of his activity. He had been arrested in 1998, September of 1998. He's got an interesting story, and he is the closest I've seen so far on our list that I look at and I go, yeah, that's definitely a serial killer in some ways. But then I started applying all the things that you just said, and I'm like, how do I know if he is or not? Next on my list was Kermit Gosnell. Do you know who that is?
I don't know.
So Kermit Gosnell ran a pretty major abortion clinic, and they call it the House of Horrors out of West Philadelphia. Now, Kermit is still alive today. He has been convicted of a lot of murder and other charges. He's actually been convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. They believe that he killed 48 people. I'm going to specify this and say babies. There was a lot of things related to how he stored and dealt with bodies that come up. But again, his suspected number is 200 plus people. Now, that story is a really horrible story. I was actually involved in a project, a documentary about him many years ago, like when he was first sort of discovered. His story is terrible. I don't know if it fits what I picture as being a traditional serial killer, but it's definitely like it is a deep dive for people with iron stomachs. If you really want to know more about him. The next on my list was Hu Wanlin. Hu Wanlin was out of China, and they actually were active from 1997 to 1999. They were proven to have killed 146 people, and it was thought they might have killed even more. The story with them is they were actually sort of a charlatan, and they ran hospitals in Shanxi, Henan, but they lacked any kind of license or medical training. He would administer miracle cures for different diseases, but he was dosing his patients with a high amount of sodium sulfate. I don't really know. Like, I don't have a lot on that one because reading the records wasn't very helpful, and all the stories are very sensationalized. But it did seem like that was less health professional and more just running a scam, and the consequence of the scam was death.
And ultimately, I feel like that. I don't know for sure. I don't know anything. I hadn't heard of that particular person, but those are typically financially motivated and
Yes,
ignorant to what's happening. What is sodium sulfate?
it actually has a lot of uses. You can find it in laundry detergent. I think there's laxatives that have it in there. It's a pretty common compound, but that's not going to be my area of expertise.
Right. Yeah. So that's a whole thing. He may have genuinely believed that it could help because, if something can get clothes clean, it can certainly heal the human body. But it doesn't sound like he had any sort of, he had no qualifications to be injecting people with anything, right?
Right.
Was it sinister? I have no idea. My guess would be that it was probably he wanted to make money, and he probably thought he was doing it in a very benign way.
Helpful, benign way. Yeah, that's kind of the
Right.
impression I get from what I've read.
And the reason I say that is because a lot of miracle cures don't kill people, right? And they are financially motivated.
Yeah.
They also don't heal anybody either. They just don't kill them. In fact, like the entire FDA system in the United States is designed to allow people to have their purported miracle cures without killing anybody, right?
Right. I would tend to agree there. Okay, so I've got my next one on my list. Not U.S. either. This is Baba Anushka, and she was the witch of Vladimirovic in Yugoslavia. She was active from the 1890s to around 1928. She had a miracle cure with arsenic in it. She's proven to have killed 50 people according to this listing. She's suspected of killing 150. She was
I would say
Go
she
ahead.
killed every single person she gave the arsenic to. That would be my guess.
Yeah, her story is a little hard to read. It's actually pretty fascinating in some ways. Overall, there is some media out there where you can read about her, and it is not. It's not very pretty. She's certainly. You could buy whatever story you want. There are some people that say that like she's just a witch and she was just kind of practicing. When they say chemist here, they mean sort of a doctor pharmacist type person. She was providing care and cures for the sick. The deal with so she would be in Serbia today, but it was Yugoslavia when she was there. She poisoned at least 50 people, and then they say possibly as many as 150 people. She did end up getting 15 years in prison in 1929, but they released her after just 7.5 years because of her old age. Let her go home to, I don't know, with a promise not to put any more arsenic in things.
Right. And in her case, I mean, was the situation one in which somebody comes in and they're like, I've got this problem. And she's like, I've got this solution. And she sells it to them. They go home and drink it.
Correct.
Okay. Well, that's different than her, like, tying them up and administering a shot of it to them.
Correct.
Right?
And they're not helpless in a hospital bed either. She mainly focused in the towns around her. She was mainly focused on married women who were kind of lonely, and she would sell them, magic water or love potions. At one point, she had a pretty nice business giving soldiers stuff they could drink to get out of having to be deployed. She was a scam artist that like it's real difficult to trace her story, and she comes off as she's either an evil witch or like a sweet loving grandmother that was trying to help anyone, or anything in between. She like you can't tell a lot about her because you don't see the motives in all this paperwork, and plus by the time I get it, it's translated through 3 languages. So
Right. And I would say there is a chance that, there could be supporting evidence that she's a serial killer. But from what I've heard so far, I don't feel like that's the case. A serial killer would never not participate actively in the moment of death.
I kind of agree with you there.
Which that also brings back these other angels of death, all these medical professionals, because most of the time they weren't there when the person died, right?
Yeah, a lot of them, that's how the case is.
It's more of a, they do whatever it is they did, and then later the person dies.
Yeah, the next guy he's along those lines. But I'll say this: he was kind of in the room. He's still got like a whole different thing going on. This is out of Brazil. This is Edson Guimarães. Now, he was not even a nurse. He was a nurse's assistant. He confessed to killing 5 people. He's only convicted of 4. But according to the prosecutors, even today, they state that he killed over 131 people. Now, what he was doing was, as a nurse's assistant, he was injecting potassium chloride. He was basically making chlorine that he injected into oxygen masks. He injected some of it into their bodies. He would also remove their oxygen mask when they needed it so they couldn't breathe. He claims everything he did was a mercy killing. He was active up until 1999 when he was arrested. In 2000, he gets convicted of 4 of the 5 murders that he confesses to. He gets 76 years in prison. His deal was he was being paid to let the local funeral homes know a patient had died so that they could be the one to contact the relatives first to collect the body and get paid for the funeral. So while he says they're mercy killings, they might have actually been like a financial scheme. Next on my list is an LPN. So that's a licensed, is it practical nurse?
I think so. Licensed practical nurse, yeah.
Out of Vermilion County, Indiana. And they mainly preyed on elderly patients. This is Orville Lynn Majors. This is a United States serial killer again. They were active from 1993 to 1995. They were proven to have killed 6 people, convicted and sentenced to roughly 360 years in prison for 6 counts of murder. Their deal was they were injecting them with potassium chloride, which is the same as the guy in Brazil. They're active from 93 to 95. I think I already said that. I was struck by how young he is. He's 56 years old today, and he is still doing prison time, even though he was apprehended in 1997, which is more than 30 years ago. So he was very young. He seems a little bit like Jonathan Hayes on a larger scale, but I think there might actually be some sinister in him. I'm not 100% sure of that. Next on my list, and then we'll kind of round this out and go to our case for today. Miyuki Ishikawa was active in Japan from 1946 to 1948. She was a midwife. She killed infants born to parents unwilling to care for them while abortion had been under prohibition in Japan. She was arrested in 1948. She had been active for a couple of years. They think she was active from 1945 to 1948. When she gets arrested, she ends up getting sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. 1953 is the final court disposition for her. Now, according to what's said here, she killed 5, but is suspected of having killed 84. And Japan is real interesting about how they talk about her records. They don't want people to realize that she had a lot of help. She was faking death certificates. She was doing a lot to cover up these crimes, which is similar to what you said. And also they kind of look at her like she's the only one on this list that is sort of looked at like she's truly providing a public service.
I think that one of the guy out of Pennsylvania,
Charles Cullen?
Kermit Gosnell.
Kermit Gosnell was he was an abortion clinic provider, but he did some stuff that was considered to be really strange.
Okay, well, I'm just saying, like, I could see some similarities between the two of them, but
Yeah.
not really.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. There's definitely some things they have in common there. Yes.
I want to be clear that I'm not saying these people aren't murderers. I'm saying that I don't know that serial killer is the appropriate title for them.
Right. I agree 100%. That's why I'm bringing them up.
Well, right. And then I realized because in the case that you just presented in Japan, you're looking into like a very deeply, it's a point of contention that could be argued from either side much more to the extent than we would ever do so on this show. Right. As far as like, was she a serial killer because she was essentially aborting babies that could have lived? Right.
Correct.
Okay. And so while I say I don't know that that is a serial killer, there's no question that she's committing murder.
Correct.
And when I thought about it, I was like, it might sound like I'm somehow negating her act, but that's not the case. You know, the solution to going against, as far as the justice system in the United States is concerned, I realize this is in Japan, but if you disagree with a law, you go through the proper channels to fix it. You don't just rebel against it, right?
Yeah.
Which is what essentially she would be doing. I just wanted to clarify that because I realized I thought to myself I might sound like I'm not making the right point.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
I had one last one before we get onto the case, and that is Kristen Gilbert. Have you ever heard of her?
Maybe.
Okay, so Kristen Gilbert, she's a nurse at a veterans medical center in Massachusetts. She was injecting male patients with epinephrine to cause heart attacks. So she was active from 1990 to 1996. Now, according to records, she is proven to have killed 5 patients, but she's actually suspected of 70 more murders, 70 or more murders. A lot of stuff that she did made me kind of question the whole angel of death idea. I pulled up like the wiki just to talk about her for a second before we switch over, but they literally called her the angel of death. In 1989, she joined the staff of the VA Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts. In 1990, she was featured in the magazine VA Practitioner in their April edition. Although other nurses noticed a high number of deaths on Kristen Gilbert's watch, they passed it off and jokingly called her the angel of death. In 1996, however, 3 nurses reported their concern about an increase in cardiac arrest deaths and a decrease in the supply of epinephrine. So they started to investigate what was going on there. She phoned in a bomb threat as part of an attempt to derail the investigation. In 1996, she left the hospital during the hospital investigation, and that fall, she checked herself into psychiatric hospitals 7 different times. She stayed between 1 and 10 days. In January of 1998, she stood trial for calling in the bomb threat to the Northampton VAMC, and the prosecutor said that she was retaliating against coworkers and her former boyfriend, James Perrault, who had also worked at the hospital for basically being a part of the investigation. In April of that year, she was convicted of that crime. Now, according to VA hospital staff members, they believe she was responsible for more than 350 deaths and that she caused more than 300 medical emergencies unnecessarily. It's interesting that all of this goes on. They do end up basically saying she was standing there killing these people, removing breathing tubes, poisoning patients, incorrectly defibrillating them, having other people incorrectly defibrillating him. A federal jury gets her case. And in March of 2001, so she's arrested multiple times, but when she's finally arrested for good, they put her on trial A federal jury convicts her of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and the prosecutors were attempting to get the death penalty. Even though it took place in Massachusetts, the federal government owned the property because it's the VA. And they were trying to admit a lot of evidence of aggravating factors about her. The defense introduced some mitigating factors, and the jury ultimately, March 26, 2001, they recommend a sentence of life imprisonment. She gets 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole and an extra 20 years. And she gets transferred from Framingham, Massachusetts to FMC Carswell, which is in Fort Worth, Texas. And she's been there ever since. She did drop her appeals after a while because it was pointed out to her that there had been a U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 2002, I think, that would have allowed the prosecutors, if they were retrying her, to again seek the death penalty. It's an interesting version of this. There are several other angels of death. I went with her because of the 350 plus possible deaths and the 300 some odd medical emergencies she seemingly caused.
Right. And so this was like a direct causation where she's injecting people with epinephrine. Is that what you said?
Yeah, epinephrine. She's causing heart attacks with essentially adrenaline.
Right. It's an EpiPen, but it's because what happens is that is actually quite useful in some situations, right? If you don't need it, though, it can make you have a heart attack, which is what happened. And, she's checking herself into psych wards, in and out of psych wards. How is that even happening? If you're checking yourself into psych wards repeatedly, somebody should notice and keep you and figure out why you're doing that. Also, though, bomb threat.
And there was some assault. She had a lot of domestic stuff going on during this time, too, where there were some assaults between her and like domestic partners and family members. There's a lot going on, is my point.
I see a little more to her than at least what was readily apparent in some of the other cases. A lot of times, it sounds like she definitely had some volatility in her personality as far as now bomb threat upon investigation. That's always interesting to me. That's
an attempt to cover your tracks or to do something.
It's a very immature. It's a reaction, not a response, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so she's reacting. She's reacting like in a quick way to thwart something that is messing up her plans. And so, but it's like something, okay, and this is why I think that, as a kid in the 80s, it's entirely possible that some of the bomb threats that were called into our schools were like kids not wanting to fail a test the next day, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And obviously, as it became more serious, people stopped doing that, right? But I can't even tell you how many times in elementary school we got marched out of the school because there was a bomb threat.
Yeah, I remember things like that. I also remember drills for different things where we were like, it's definitely a huge interruption, but you're right. It's so immature.
She's reacting to the possibility of being caught. Now, it does sound like some of her coworkers subtly picked up on it, sort of. The extent that they're talking about at the end of it, though, everybody should have been noticing all the time. So I'm not trying to say that. I feel like once investigators get to the point where they're going to prosecute a case of an angel of death, so to speak, they have to go big or go home. There is a lot of very specific decisions that have to be made anytime somebody's having medical care. Of course, anybody could die at any time, but when someone's in a facility being cared for and they die and they pile up in this pile under one specific alleged perpetrator in 10 years, right? It leads me to believe that they had conditions that didn't immediately raise red flags when they did pass at the time, right?
Yeah.
And so when you're looking at situations like that, I sort of believe that, I believe his name was Shipman in the UK. I believe he was basically like a assisted suicide type doctor, right?
Kind of, yeah. I don't want to be curt about him or he's not the focus of what we're doing. So I don't want to lean one way or the other on Shipman.
Well, but I mean, that doesn't mean that he wasn't pseudo responsible. And, obviously he was tried and convicted and it went through their system. But you have to, I think that it is appropriate for a jury to sit and listen to any sort of case that's going to be brought against someone like this, and to, based on the facts presented, make a finding. I don't think when they're suspected 400 victims, that's not what was put before any jury, right? Those numbers are not what they were not what any of them were convicted on. You're never convicted of a suspected murder, right?
Right.
The nuances involved, I feel could drastically limit the victim count in a lot of cases. The sinisterness could, strike the serial part of the killer right off, because there's really no serial to it. They were just really underinformed. Seems like Kristen Gilbert, especially. Was she the only female we talked about today?
No, there's a couple in there. Baba was in there.
And
3, I think, out of the 11 were female.
She seemed to have some, I would say, she was taking something out on somebody, right? But that doesn't. She could possibly be a serial killer, but we would have to have more information, and I'm very disappointed that people didn't take a lot more notice a lot sooner, right? If she was, because that's I would say that's pretty direct. Injecting someone with
epinephrine, yeah.
With epinephrine and causing them to have a heart attack and go into cardiac arrest and die. I mean, that's not a whole lot different than just shooting them.
It's something, man. It's a very strange method.
But what if she had a reason why she was doing that? Of course, you don't also then call in a bomb threat,
right?
And then check yourself in and out of psychiatric treatment facilities repeatedly. That's really strange. I want to be here. I don't want to be here. I'm better. I'm not better. I don't know what all's going on there, but she needed help, right? I do feel a lot of red flags were being raised that could indicate why she should never have been alone with a patient to do something like that. I feel that's kind of a standard thing that you want with medical care providers is, just at least on surface level, you're not concerned about their being in the immediate vicinity of a patient.
Yeah.
Somebody that's, calling in bomb threats and going to the psych ward, and at least until, everything gets sorted, they probably shouldn't be around people in need of medical care.
Yeah. I bring all of these up and I talk about all these people to hear the different responses. And you have very similar thoughts on this to me, to what I was thinking about all of this. But I had one I wanted to run by you as our case for today. And I know this is it's not a super long case. I just have some interesting questions about it. This is an Ohio case that kind of sprawls a little bit over the lines. So this person that we're going to talk about is not a nurse or a doctor. Some different jobs, though, were held in healthcare. They're born in April 1952. It's the oldest of 3 kids. They're raised in a little town. They're born in Hamilton, Ohio, but then raised in Boonville, Kentucky. His parents were farmers, Family went to the local Baptist church. From the time they were 5 to the time they turned 18 years old, they were molested by an uncle and a neighbor, but didn't tell anyone except for a sister. And that was only after the abuse had ended. Now, they dropped out of school in the 9th grade, but they earned a GED from a correspondence school in 1968. So that would have made them roughly 16. In 1971, they get arrested for a burglary. And I don't think it's their first arrest. I think it's the first one that sticks. That's in March of 1971. So this person decides they're going to go into the U.S. Air Force. About 9 months later, they get discharged because they have 2 suicide attempts, which are classified by the Air Force as, quote, nervous breakdowns. And apparently what he had discovered, and these are his words, not mine, was that he was, quote, homosexual. Like he puts that in the exit paperwork. He basically says he came to terms with being, quote, homosexual. And that's part of something. I don't know exactly why that gets put in here, the way that it's put in here in the different stories that I've read. It's in multiple sources. So he begins working in hospitals at the age of 18. So that is a lot to have done by the time that 1970 rolls around. And even though the burglary happens right after that, he had been an orderly in Kentucky. Now, there's a lot to his story that is going to take a minute to get to, but this is Donald Harvey. Have you ever heard of him?
Yes.
Okay, so he kills in a 10-month period while he's working at the age of 18 at Marymount Hospital. He kills at least a dozen patients. The second victim that he had is a guy named James Tyree. And technically, James Tyree is an accident. But there's a kid in the room when that one happens. That's a 12-year-old kid named Danny George. What Donald Harvey says when he's finally caught in 1987, so much later, is that he was killing these victims out of a sense of empathy. That turns out to maybe not be the case. The way that he kind of tries to spell it all out is that he felt like those people were suffering. His victims were suffering. They were there for things that he, in his mind, saw as terminally ill. And some of them are, but not all of them. But he later admits that many of the killings he committed because he was mad at them. He was angry at the victims. His victims are all over the spectrum, but they tend to lean towards more late middle-aged to elderly patients. But he kills men, women, various races, various backgrounds. The only thing that they all seem to have in common was they were all cardiac patients. Now, it's been written multiple places that we will never actually know how much stuff Don Harvey did. And one of the reasons was he went undetected for 17 years. He did not have a particular MO, and he chose a lot of different ways to kill his victims. He poisoned some of them, he overdosed some of them, and there's a pretty distinct difference in those two things. A poisoning is when you introduce a completely foreign thing that's going to kill you. An overdose is similar to the insulin deaths, where you're giving them something that is a medicine, could be their medicine, but you're doing it in a way that is too much for the human body to take. He also suffocated people. He deprived several patients of ventilators, and he would administer, they describe it in the court records as a serum, but they're talking about different fluids that have been tainted with hepatitis B and or HIV. There were a few people that got hepatitis infections. There's not a tracked HIV infection. He did some weird things with catheters that caused like a very slow, painful death for at least one, maybe two patients. His most used methods were to administer by injection or food cyanide and arsenic. His crimes took place at 3 different hospitals, from what we can tell. That's at least the majority of them did. He worked at Marymount Hospital in Kentucky. He worked at Cincinnati's Drake Memorial Hospital, and he worked at the Cincinnati VA Medical Hospital. Different times he worked as an orderly, and he had also worked as an autopsy assistant. He is the first one that we're talking about today that he gets outside of the hospital. So he wasn't just killing hospital patients. When his lover, Carl Howler, was thought to be cheating on him, he poisoned Carl with arsenic so he couldn't leave. And he also had poisoned 2 of his neighbors. Diane Alexander, he put hepatitis serum in her drink. And he actually killed Helen Metzger by putting arsenic in a pie that she was eating. And he killed Carl's father, Henry, with arsenic as well. So he's the first one we run into today where we're really out in conclusive land that this guy is killing. So he slips up in March of 1987 and he gets caught. There's an autopsy done on a man named John Powell. John Powell had died abruptly after being on life support for quite some time after a motorcycle accident. The toxicology report for John Powell's autopsy revealed that he had large amounts of cyanide in his system. So investigators started looking at Donald Harvey. They learned that he had been forced to resign from the Cincinnati VA hospital after he was caught stealing body parts. He had told the hospital administrators, once that was investigated and he was caught, that he was stealing the body parts for rituals. At the time, most hospitals in the U.S. were not doing a lot of background work on their orderlies as much as they were trying to do it on their doctors and nurses. They bring him in to question him, and he confesses to John Powell's murder. He claims that he had euthanized him with cyanide. Now, he gets the attention of a Cincinnati news station, WCPO, anchor named Pat Minarson. And Pat finds it unlikely that someone who had been working in hospitals around patients for 20 years would suddenly kill one without having killed anyone before. So he goes on the news talking about Donald Harvey's arrest, and Pat asks on the air if there had been any other deaths. And sources start coming forward. And it gets revealed to WCPO, who do a pretty deep dive on this case, that multiple nurses at Drake Hospital had raised concerns with the administrators when they noticed that there was a spike in deaths while Donald Harvey was employed there. The administrators told them not to say anything and not to go outside of the hospital, to come to them if they wanted to talk about it. Those nurses reached out to Pat, and they told him that Donald Harvey had killed at least 10 more people. So over the next few months, Pat investigates all these suspicious deaths, and he brings enough evidence together to do a half-hour special report detailing evidence that over the course of 4 years, Donald Harvey was likely linked to at least 24 murders. He had been able to stay under the radar because he worked in an area of the hospital at Drake where most of the patients that came through were not expected to survive. So his attorney is a court-appointed attorney named Bill Whalen. WCPO TV and the anchor, Pat, they call Bill Whalen to get his opinion about what their findings are related to Donald Harvey's employment over the last 4 or 5 years. And he immediately goes to Donald Harvey and asks him, did you kill anyone else? And Harvey tells Bill Whalen that if he were to put numbers on it, his estimate would be that he had probably killed around 70 people. Now, where they were in time, Bill Whalen knew that if the prosecutors could link Donald Harvey to more than one murder, the death penalty would be on the table. So Bill Whalen talks to Donald, and then he goes back to the prosecutors and he says, if you guys take the death penalty off the table, Donald Harvey will take a sentence of life without parole, and he will bring you a confession. The prosecutors agree to this. It saves them a lot of time and resources. And they have this week-long period where Donald Harvey details the murders of 24 people. August of 1987 rolls around. Donald Harvey pleads guilty to 24 counts of first-degree murder. Now, the way the plea agreement is set up, he gets sentenced to 3 concurrent terms of life in prison. So they're all running at the same time. But he is in violation of the plea agreement if any more murders come to light. So Whalen gets to work, and he puts together a timeline of Donald Harvey's life. And Donald Harvey pleads guilty to, this is down in Laurel County, Kentucky, to 9 more patients in the 1970s. He gets life plus 20 years, and it's going to run at the same time as the Ohio sentence. All told, Harvey has confessed to killing around 50 people in detail, but he pleads guilty to 37 murders. And he gets sentenced to he goes off to prison, like he's no longer in jail and he's no longer awaiting trial on October 26th of 1987. Now, online, they have a list of his victims. And what I've been able to come across, there are 47 known victims for him, in spite of the 37 convictions. And they really do run the gamut. Now, I see why they did what they did, because some of these, he does stupid stuff and people are sort of on the outside of it and they end up having an accidental death. Like one of them is listed as heart attack, drank alcohol that Harvey had put poison in, but it was meant for someone else. It's wild. One of them was that he gave someone the wrong size catheter, which caused them to vomit blood and die. Another one he smothered with a pillow. Another gentleman, as terrible as this sounds, he flipped him over onto his back at a time when he was being treated for fluid on his lungs, and he basically drowned in his own fluids.
Why was he touching a patient?
He was an orderly.
Okay, but he should only be doing something like that at the direction of a medical care professional.
I don't disagree with you there.
Okay.
He would give people empty oxygen tanks. He did some really vile things in terms of what he did with a catheter. He actually punctured someone's right.
So do orderlies do catheters?
Apparently so. He has several on here. I just want to know, what do you think about this guy?
He most definitely is a serial killer. Okay, so one of the things about him is, from everything I can tell, he provided the information about the people that he killed. There was not a situation where investigators derived it from any other set of data.
Yeah.
Okay, and so he went back through and he said this, that, and the other. Now, there's in the information about him, it's indicated that the second victim there was a witness. I think that it's possible that was entirely an accident. I don't know why he was handling catheters to begin with. Whatever. It doesn't really matter. I guess I have a misunderstanding of what orderlies do. But I think that there's no question he's a serial killer. He probably really was thinking that he was helping some of these people. But it wasn't his call to make, ever. It's entirely possible that he really believed that his motive was sympathy for people who were that it was a sympathy killing, right?
Like it was
Where
empathy for the terminal nature of what's happening to them. Is that what you mean?
he could have possibly like genuinely believed that, but it wasn't his call to make.
Well, but that doesn't make sense in terms of like the neighbors and the
Right,
love. He
which
killed
is
several lovers.
right. And so what I had said was that he was without question a serial killer. The motivations in his serial killing, one thing about him I found interesting when compared to other serial killers that I consider to be actual serial killers is it does appear that he was at least acquainted with all of his victims.
Yeah, it looks like he had the opportunity to meet all of them because of
Right.
his job and his interaction with them.
Right. And so a lot of times, and in my opinion, that lends him to be more towards like an asshole killer, right? Because he says that he was providing sympathy, a sympathy. I don't know how to say it. He was euthanizing them, basically.
There were mercy killings in his mind and the way he explained it to people.
Right, but I mean, he can't anymore make that call than you or I could make that call.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
And the fact that he's doing it like he is, it honestly makes me think that he was probably tired of doing something for them. I don't know what it would have been, but whatever his job as an orderly was, he probably didn't want to do it anymore, so he killed them. The sympathy involved was probably highly self-serving.
Yeah.
Now, he had other issues going on in life that clearly they lead to sort of wondering, well, is this guy okay, right? As far as like, not graduating from school and making sort of, he just made choices that, maybe he wasn't, he didn't have an exact plan, and that made him act a little erratically. I think that a lot of time, of course, if you kill somebody that is medically disadvantaged in that they can't take care of themselves or defend themselves in any way, the only thing that you can say without sounding like a psychopathic, lunatic is that you were mercy killing them, right? There's nothing they could be doing that would justify it. I mean, there's just no way. And so, I mean, to me, that seems like a cop-out type of response. He could have possibly believed it. But the thing about it is there were nurses that noticed, but it starts with a journalist, right? A journalist that's going, wonder what else he's done. I find it hard to believe that he could have done this having worked in the medical environment for all these years. I find it hard to believe this is the first time he did it, right?
Oh,
so
yeah,
is
this isn't
making
the only
a murderer? Is he making a murderer? The nurses come forward. They talk to the journalist. Is it sensationalized? I would have to say that there's at least a portion of this story that's sensationalized. I have no idea what it is. I do find it more credible that he presents the timeline. From what I can see, he pled guilty. There was no trial. There was
Correct.
no reason that anything in his, I presume that there was corroboration done to the extent that was required by the prosecutors to or for the judge to accept the plea made between his defense attorney, himself, and the prosecutors, right? We don't have any information about any of that stuff. And so for all we know, he recounted, 30 people that he remembered dying while he was working as an orderly. Don't know that at the time of any of his victims' deaths, that their deaths were declared to be homicides.
It doesn't seem like they would be based on how all of this shakes out.
And so if you have been convicted based on a plea and the plea derived from your confession, of killing 30 people whose cause of death was accidental.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier. Like, there should be better, and this has come up with Shipman, with Gosnell. There should be better checks and balances and statistical analysis in place to determine like what's really happening. Because even if you have, say, 30 accidentals that happen to fall on your shift or whatever, I don't know that gets captured anywhere. With the best statistical analysis, I think that would be missed. I don't know what the solution would be for a guy like Donald Harvey. I don't know. They should have caught him early on. They should have caught him when that first catheter went wrong. Don't you think?
I find it hard to believe that it's only seen to be this sensationalized in retrospect. It's not like, I understand that prosecutors wanted to, nobody wants to have a trial. Like, it's bad for the victims, and it's a disaster most of the time. I can tell you one thing, though. He never would have been convicted of all those murders had he gone to trial, because some of them weren't even murders.
See, I don't know how I feel about that. And I mean, we're not going to get to an answer today. I'm just telling you, I don't know how I feel about that, because you're right. There are a lot of accidental deaths listed beside him as victims.
And he confessed to it, right? He confessed to this timeline of people that he killed after a journalist posed the question. Nurses that had worked with him responded to the journalist.
Right.
The journalist talked to his defense attorney. They take death off the table, and he starts making confessions. Okay.
I thought I found one that you wouldn't tear apart.
I'm sorry, but it's entirely I told you, I give credibility to the fact that he said, okay, here's what I did, right? Not that police brought it to him and he was like, yep, check, check, check. From what I read, he presented this list. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right. There was also other people besides in the medical field. Now, did he just recount all the people around him that had died?
No, I don't think that's what's happening. No.
Well, I mean, do you think that he was responsible?
The minute he crosses outside, okay, for me, what makes this guy a bad dude, and it makes me look at the list and go, okay, where's arsenic and cyanide? Because I know he did that outside the hospital. These other 3 people died outside the hospital connected to him from arsenic and cyanide.
Well, were those open homicide investigations?
I don't know the answer to that.
And my impression is no, they were not. There was no indication of what had occurred, and that they had died, because these were, if nothing else, older. Okay, they may not have been old, so to speak, but they were older people who died, and the ones outside the hospital, right?
Well, no, 2 of them were his age. They were people he had been in relationships with. I follow what you're saying in terms of like the bulk of these could be other things. But here's where I am a little lost, and that is 2 periods of time he's got on here where, and I think they would go. Are you thinking they didn't go back and verify this? They just took it as a plea?
I don't think that they went back and they changed 47 people's causes of death. No, I don't think they did that.
So James Peluso, he's 65, so he's a little older. He says that he poisoned him with arsenic. He was one of Harvey's ex-lovers. So that's one of them.
Okay, but was his death under investigation as a homicide by poisoning?
Honestly, if it was arsenic, probably not.
Right, exactly. That's what I'm saying. We have no idea if that guy died from a heart attack that was completely natural or if he actually poisoned him with arsenic. There's no indication that an autopsy was done and that there was a suspected poisoning and that they were looking into this homicide death, right? So that makes me wonder, did Donald Harvey just recount all the people around him that had died in some way that he felt like he could twist the narrative? We also don't know exactly what came straight out of his mouth versus what came out of his mouth, went through his attorney's mouth, ended up coming out of the journalist's mouth. This is a situation where, do you honestly believe that two nurses would associate one person with 10 murders and listen to their organization telling them not to go to the police?
That is the whole reason that we are here today talking about this. Not because I think I know it all, because I looked at it and I went, what is not making sense here?
Well, I don't believe for a second that anybody, much less a nurse or a doctor or any other medical professional, unless, unless you're talking about an angel of death, I don't think anybody would look at 10 murders and then have somebody tell you not to go to the police and you would listen. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Okay. 10 murders. And not to mention the fact, if you notice, what is said is that 10 people died while he worked there. As far as I know, orderlies are sort of like assistants that handle like security aspects as far as holding patients and restraining them to when ordered to by doctors or nurses, right?
And they transport them.
They transport them. They're typically stronger type people who do, and then they also do menial tasks that, they may not enjoy doing, like changing bedpans or whatever, right? The stuff has to be done. That was my understanding of what an orderly is. Now, I've never actually been to a hospital and seen an orderly. Have you?
Yes.
So they still have job. That's still a thing.
That is still a thing, yes.
Okay, and so the name orderly means that like they are helping to maintain order at the hospital.
They're cleaning up to a degree. Yeah, kind of.
Right, but like, on a shit, so in the entertainment realm, if somebody calls for an orderly, they typically are grabbing someone along with security to restrain them or whatever. Orderly, come help, right?
I follow what you're saying. If you were watching ER or Grey's Anatomy or something, yes.
Correct, but they're not a nurse. And so my point is, when you've got nurses saying there are 10 people who died while this guy was working out, 10 people died while he was there and their deaths were suspicious. Okay. Yeah. I presume there's about 10 people that would have come into contact at a more intimate or intimate's not the right word, a closer proximity than the orderly would have come into contact with them.
Yeah, but that might also be the reason that he flies under the radar as long as he does.
That's entirely possible. You're right. It is. But here's the problem with that. 10 people.
I'm with you.
And I get that the nurses made the connection. I like to think that the institution or the center or the hospital or whatever, they said like, that's coincidental, but ridiculous because like we wouldn't have somebody working here that would do that, right? And they didn't want to have some sort of big stir started. If we were able to look through this and you could tell me that there's 47 lines on his known victims. Okay. So it's 47 people.
Yeah. That's how he didn't make the top 10 is he only has the 47. He actually has 50 confessions roughly.
This is 47 confirmed. Right. That's what's said. And I presume that's in his confession, right?
Yeah. This is only the people who died. There are 5 or 6 people who did not die.
Okay. And then he pled guilty to, 24 plus 9. Is that where that number comes from?
Yeah. He pled guilty to a total of 37.
Okay. And so That's what's in his
His jacket.
adjudication.
Yeah,
Okay.
his jacket. Yeah.
All right. And so what I initially said was, okay, like were there 37 cases that were open that they closed? I don't think that's the case. Okay. I don't think there's
Well, there were
37 open murders.
a lot of these. I noticed if you go down the list here, there are a lot of accidental deaths that they leave as accidental deaths. They just say, for instance, I think there was one where the person suffocated because he handed them an empty oxygen tank and they called it accidental. And then they have one that they called intentional but not premeditated, which was another person who suffocated and had cardiac arrest because he gave them an empty oxygen tank. So I don't know what they're doing here, and I wasn't going to.
We also don't know that that's really what happened when they died, right?
I can't find anywhere. Going through all of this, there's a lot of media coverage of him, a lot of podcasts that are like very comedic and goofy cover this case. But when I dig into it and do actual research, I cannot find any real secondary investigations after he basically is arrested and then goes to prison. The closest that we get from that is the WCPO TV teams, which when they're doing their investigation and they get awards for it. And that's why everybody else covers it. But they're doing that in the 1980s. And I don't see anything here where I look at it and go, I now understand this clearly. Like, I don't think all right. I say it that way because I don't think there's a lot of police involved here. He is never brought up on federal charges. And that's, I do a lot of goofy stuff on our podcast, but I mentioned the other case with Kristen Gilbert at the VA center because Donald Harvey also worked at a VA medical center and another hospital in Kentucky and a hospital in Ohio. I don't see a bunch of investigation being done here to confirm, like some of them, yes, there are a few of these cases, particularly the one where he says that Ben Gilbert was an 81-year-old male. He died on July 28th of 1970. He had an infection, but he had knocked Donald Harvey out with a bedpan. So then Harvey gave him a catheter that was too big, which would hurt. And then he stuck a straightened piece of metal thought to be a coat hanger through it, which punctured Gilbert's urethra. And when it punctured there, or went through his urethra, it actually punctured his bladder and his intestines. He went into basically septic shock. Then he went into a coma and he died 4 days later. That was an intentional premeditated murder by Donald Harvey, according to his list.
I'm sorry?
According to this list.
Right, okay, which would have been immediately apparent to the hordes of medical professionals around him and investigated right then.
Or the idiot 18-year-old orderly just killed a patient and we need to not screw our insurance policy, not end up in a lawsuit. Do you see what I mean?
I feel like, well, so then you've got all these medical people, right?
I know.
Okay, so I feel like it's more like this is a story he's telling, and there's no indication of anything beyond the 81 dying from a septic shock, the result of a septic infection.
Yeah, I have no way of looking at this and going, this is legit, this isn't. And I have looked.
Well, let's just keep in mind, though, I just want to say, John Powell is who starts this. He was on life support. I don't know how old John Powell was.
He was 44.
Okay, so he's 44. He was in a motorcycle accident. He's on life support, and he died suddenly, and his autopsy reveals cyanide in his system. Okay?
Correct.
And so at that point, Donald Harvey becomes
a suspect.
They end up charging him. he resigns from the Cincinnati VA hospital because he's been caught stealing body parts.
That gets revealed like while they're investigating John Powell's death.
Right. Okay. And so keep in mind that John Powell is actually the one situation where it could have genuinely been that he was trying to mercy kill him. He was young. He was on life support. He had been in a motorcycle accident. It seems legitimate to me that an orderly would have absolutely no idea, like it. And so he, I didn't know cyanide was going to make him go through an even more painful death. I was trying to help this guy be put out of his misery.
Right.
Okay. So then, and that's what goes along with what he said he did, right?
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't fit everybody because we don't even know that any of this other stuff happened.
I don't know how okay, so we're in a situation where that happens in 1987. It's literally March of 1987. So I think you could verify, like there's a handful of murders in 1987 that you could go back and you see, okay, well, all of these people had a couple of chemicals in them. There's a lot of cyanide in these 5. There's a lot of alcohol in these 3. I think you're close enough in time that if it happened right at the end of 86 into 87, maybe some investigation can be done. Where it gets confusing for me is that just where he's at right now in this general area, it goes back to 1983. And from there, you jump all the way back to 1971.
Right. And that's the kind of gap a serial killer usually wouldn't have, right?
They could if they had a relationship or something going on. I mean, there's a number of reasons for it. But what is so interesting to me in terms of official records, meaning things that like look like an investigation, and like usually I would say something like court documents because that's where I go. But like I would settle here for police reports. I would also settle here for insurance settlements. I would settle here for anything that happens in the court indicating that, say, John Powell's family got a settlement because Drake Memorial settled out with them. I don't find any of that in this case. The more I dig, the more murky it gets.
Correct. And so do you believe that he did all this?
I believe that this is one of the most first of all, it's one of the most interesting angel of death cases. Whether he actually is an angel of death or not, I'm not sure. And like I have his, I've gone through and done all the things I typically do in terms of like requesting records requests. I have a lot of information. Like I have a whole profile on him from the Radford people I didn't put in here. I have a lot of stuff going on where I can look at it and I understand where they're getting the information. What I can't figure out is why no one noticed in the 70s, because you have 3 solid years of murder that nobody seemed to notice. I have a lot of information coming out of his mouth, but there is nothing in here to indicate, 1, why did he go undetected? 2, how do we confirm all of this? 3, what is going on in terms of like why are we looking at this so far in the future, because we're in 2024 now and I can't pretty obviously tell what happened.
Well, I would be happy with just information that I don't know what the number would be, but less than all but more than one of these were open homicide investigations before he was being investigated for John Powell's death due to cyanide being found in his body during an autopsy. Any number of them being an open investigation with the police that they were homicide cases.
Well, I can tell you, like, for instance, I was able to pull up a lot about Helen Metzger. She was killed in 1983, April of 1983. I can tell you that there were reports that her entire family got sick from something in the mayonnaise at a gathering at her apartment after the funeral. I can tell you that, like, that appears to be because he claims he made her sick and that's how she died. But what I can tell you is I have a death certificate for Helen Metzger, who is a 63-year-old woman who died from Guillain-Barré syndrome.
Which is not murder.
Right. So then, allegedly, also, same vein, in May of 1983, I have a death certificate for Henry Howler, who is Carl Howler, one of Donald Harvey's lovers' father. He was 82 years old, and he gets sick. And on April 25th, 1983, he's admitted to a hospital. He dies, and his cause of death says that he died from a stroke and subsequent kidney failure. And I can tell you that Howard...
Which is also not murder.
That's what I'm saying. I can also tell you that Howard Vetter, who was Carl Howler's sister's husband, got hold of a bottle, and Carl and Howard drank some alcohol. Howard had several drinks from it, and that in late 1983, he got really sick. And he was sick into early 1984, and then he had a heart attack. And on his death certificate, it says he had a cardiac arrest.
All right. Now, to you, does that sound like somebody who perhaps was trying to mercy kill John Powell, presented with information that if he were to confess that he wouldn't face the death penalty, and he began recounting every person in his life that had died?
Look, it runs the gamut. In April of 1986, a guy named Nathan Watson, or Nathan E. Watson, I don't know, it has an I in some places, not in others. He dies, and we've never figured out what happened to him. He was a semi-comatose man. He was feeding through a gastric tube. Now, what he tells investigators in his confessions is that he didn't think that Watson should live that way. But then he tells them that he had smothered him multiple times with a wet plastic garbage can liner. So basically Harvey was coming in and out of rooms and changing the trash can. He took a roll of the trash can liners, tore one off, got it wet, and put it over Mr. Watson's mouth and nose. He did this 2 or 3 times, and he says he got interrupted.
Well, and I find that weird that nobody said, "Hey, Harvey," or "Hey, buddy, don't be doing that."
Well, he says that he put a pillow over his face, held the garbage bag in place, and then he threw the plastic bag in the trash that he was carrying and kept going to the next room. That's what he says happened. And I can tell you that a semi-comatose man who matches that description, age, name, everything, in a place that Donald Harvey would have been, definitely died. But
right.
He was in a hospital, basically in intensive care, to
and he
begin
died.
with. Right.
There's no evidence that actually happened except when it came out of his mouth during the confession.
But then when he's retelling that confession, he tells his attorney that he did it because he had heard that Nathan E. Watson was a convicted rapist. I can't tell you if he actually is a convicted rapist or not. I can just tell you that is a wildly different motive than I didn't think he should live that way.
Right, and it makes it less plausible. This is regardless, okay, unless it was obvious, and I'm not saying this to lessen his death, but unless Nathaniel J. Watson had an open homicide investigation, which shouldn't be the case for somebody who's semi-comatose in the hospital, because if they were killed clearly the medical professionals around him would recognize that and hopefully prevent it from happening. But additionally, they would not cover it up, right?
Yeah.
And I think it is possible that Donald Harvey had recollections of the different people that he had seen in the course of doing his job dying. Not to mention, I believe the nurses that contacted the journalists provided a list of suspicious deaths while he worked at a particular facility. And so if I'm just saying that if I don't believe, okay, I do not believe that there's 47 other than homicide cases that just on the word of this one man all became homicides that he is responsible for. I don't believe that.
Well, ultimately, from the death certificates I get my hands on and what I can go through and look for, these range, they weren't really written up as natural causes. But I will say this, and then I'm going to kind of wind this down because I'm sure I'm getting long here. These people were already in a position that when they died, except for John Powell, he was very stable medically. These people were already in a position that them dying in intensive care and critical care units, particularly on cardiac wards, seemed to be expected. There's not a lot of autopsies in here. The autopsy on John Powell is one of the only records of an autopsy I can find in all of this mess. Isn't that strange?
I think the reason that he had an autopsy was because he was young, and while he had issues from his accident, it didn't make sense if he was on like his life support or whatever that he died, right?
Yeah.
In a case, and see, that's something again that it makes sense that Donald Harvey would have miscalculated, because in the event that you're on life support, and so the only thing keeping you alive is the machines, and so something else killing you is really weird. Like literally what kills you is when they turn the machine off because it's no longer supporting your life. And so you just wouldn't suffer from cyanide poisoning. I feel like just like that raised a flag. A lot of these other deaths should have. But he was a little younger. He was 44. I don't think all these people had autopsies done on them. I don't actually know what the protocol is for that.
It would vary time and space.
Right. And I do know once you get to a certain age, they don't do autopsies on everybody, especially if you die in an attended facility. And that could be one of the reasons that these types of cases, as they get shaped and formed and they develop a narrative like this one did, it becomes this like sinister type thing because, you know, if you die in the presence and under the care of a doctor and you're of a certain age, they don't always do an autopsy. I really think the age factor here is what the difference would have been between John Powell and the rest of them. I just wish that there could have been a little more corroboration with the earlier cases, because when I was reading about what all happened, it seemed to me like he literally just made a list of everybody he could remember that died.
It kind of feels like that a little bit. Especially
when like his neighbors and like lovers and father-in-laws get thrown in there. It's a strange thing.
It is, to say the very least, this whole scenario is a very, very strange thing.
Where did he get so much cyanide from?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer specifically where he got it from. I got the impression that it was available in the hospital and that at one point in time we maybe used it for a couple of things, but you weren't supposed to be putting it in people.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think it was maybe pest control, but I don't know that for sure. There were other compounds he used along the way that pop up, and I was just like, I don't even know what this is. There was a couple of them I had to go look up because I was like, I do not know why this guy had, this poison that he could get his hands on between the cyanide and the arsenic. I knew the arsenic came from rat poison, I believe. But he was using cleaning fluids. He had used, at one point, a couple of the people had morphine overdoses and Demerol overdoses. He had these weird, like, HIV and hepatitis injections he was doing.
But we don't know that any of this was corroborated.
No, that's what I'm saying. I can't corroborate it because of the way it went down. There's not really going to be a record of it. And I think some of the poisons you could, like, test for after the fact, like you could exhume the bodies. But I don't know how you do that in a case that spans this much time. Like, because this is literally 17 years. I don't know that anybody really wants to admit, other than Cincinnati police, who were the first ones brought in that go, wait a second, what? That's because, so the way that goes down is he's brought in for an autopsy, and Lee Lehman, he is a guy who specifically knows about biochemistry. So he knew what it smelled like. He cut into John Powell and he smelled bitter almonds. So he knew something was wrong. He proceeded with the autopsy and he tagged onto it to send samples out to other labs to confirm that the bitter almonds are actually cyanide. So when that happens, that's in March of 87, the Cincinnati police get involved. So you're not talking about a hospital administrator. You're not talking about somebody who's in the facility that's in with Donald Harvey. It's been sent to a forensic pathologist. Why they do it, I don't know. But the cops start looking for how John Powell died for basically the reasons that you said. He's hooked up in here pretty stable in a way that we would have signs if he were, like, deteriorating to the point of death. So they looked at his food supply in the hospital. They interrogated his wife. They went and interrogated the nurses. And one of those nurses actually brings up Donald Harvey's name. And they went so far as to ask for volunteers for polygraph tests. And everybody volunteers for these polygraph tests. And Donald does too. But Donald had gone and bought a book on how to beat lie detector tests. But then he called in sick the day of his test and didn't take it. Since he didn't take it, he got the attention of the detectives. So 2 detectives come in. If I recall correctly, it's Jim Lawson and Ronald Camden. They come in and they good cop, bad cop him. And he confesses that he had put liquid cyanide in John Powell's gastric tube. He said that he did it because he felt sorry for him and his family. And he tells them he had never done that before. He just did it in this case. And he gets indicted a couple weeks later for first-degree murder in the death of John Powell. They immediately give him a public defender and send him for a competency hearing. And he gets cleared for the competency hearing. And that guy says there's nothing wrong with him. He has, like, some weird stuff that's gone on in his life, but he's not psychotic and he's not, whatever. And then June of 87, that's when WCPO talks about it, and they start getting information about Donald. So I don't know what really is happening here. I don't know how this is not quite as egregious as, like, Henry Lucas and Ottis Toole, but it is weird. And
It's also not as clear because this guy at least had some sort of tie to all the people listed as his victims and his confession. Henry and Ottis, they didn't have any ties to any of those people.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And I think, he confesses in September to a lot of crimes. And then over the course of 2 months, that's not long enough to be exhuming bodies and verifying details. He's basically given a list to the investigators, and the investigators, so they sort of go, okay, did they die? Was he there? Were they there? Was there anything that could be going on? Now, there are civil suits that you can start finding in Hamilton County, Ohio, and like they're like for millions and millions of dollars.
Was it all after he had confessed?
Well, it was actually a bunch of people that he didn't kill. It was other people who died in the hospitals.
Okay, so who are they suing?
They start suing the hospital, saying like this one family it's a guy named Shelton Gillespie, and I don't think Shelton's on the list, but his Shelton Gillespie is the widower of Ruth Gillespie. She files a $25 million lawsuit for compensatory damages and another $50 million suit for punitive damages against Donald Harvey, against someone named Jan Taylor, the Board of Hamilton County Commissioners, and the Daniel Drake Memorial Hospital. But Harvey didn't confess to being involved in Ruth Gillespie's death, and her case was not part of the plea bargain. In fact, in the middle of all his confessions, he denied that he had anything to do with what had happened to her. And he was listed as one of the assistants on her autopsy. That's how she gets tied to it. But Jan Taylor was his supervisor at Drake Memorial. Now, she ended up pleading no contest to falsification of public documents because she had done some stuff related to handwritten notes in Donald Harvey's file that indicated she had done a background check on Donald Harvey and that his other employers had said that that he was eligible for rehire. I don't know what's going on here, but I can tell you that like in all those cases, they basically settled them all out. That one even settled for $45,000. It was a multi-million-dollar suit. It settled out. There were a lot of suits brought by actual families of the victims against the hospital administrators, the trustees, various medical staff members. Almost all of it settles through insurance. You can find some records, but it doesn't have the meaty records that you would expect. And they didn't have enough time to have done like, let's just throw this out there. They didn't have enough time to do 47 exhumations from the time he confessed to the time they charge him. And ultimately, because it ends in a plea bargain, they get away with, oh, we didn't do that because it closed out. He pled guilty.
Right. So going along with what you said about the autopsy initially indicating to the coroner or the medical examiner of bitter almonds, right?
Yeah.
All right. And so I'd just be interested to know, because there's like leading up to that, is the same person doing all these autopsies?
No, you're spread over multiple locations. There's at least 3 locations here. That guy only does John Powell's autopsy.
So how many places was Donald Harvey working?
Okay, so the people up to John Powell.
Okay, I see. Because they're older, they
weren't being autopsied every time. Some of them were done
homicide victims,
right? But Lee Lehman is a forensic pathologist. So
is he who did John Powell's?
Yes.
Okay.
That's a real autopsy for the first time, in my opinion, in all of these cases. That is the only one I see that's a real autopsy. And it's sort of one of those confluence of events because he knows chemistry, that he smells it and knows it's cyanide.
Right. And my understanding was that somebody put cyanide in this guy's feeding tube.
Correct.
Okay. And in theory, that didn't even have to be a person that was working at the hospital.
Correct.
They good cop, bad copped him. He supposedly bought a book on how to pass a lie detector test. I guess when you're lying, I'm not really sure. I guess that's why you would want to get a book to pass, right? Because you would fail otherwise. And so there's that indication. There's no corroboration. That's just part of the story, right? And additionally, you've got a guy who calls in and doesn't come to his lie detector.
Yeah, he got on their radar all on his own from that point forward.
Right, and then he was good cop, bad cop into confessing, I guess.
Yeah, but you have to remember that's just a couple days earlier. That one they can verify. There's lab results. There's like leftover evidence.
Right, but you understand that it is entirely possible that this dude like legitimately never bought a book, was sick on the day that he had his lie detector test and he didn't take it, and everybody else passed because like it wasn't somebody at the facility.
Could be that.
Okay, and then, you get him for taking body parts, which is like a whole different situation.
Well, that's earlier, though. The body parts was an earlier dismissal. It doesn't alleviate your questions. I understand that.
It really doesn't. And I feel like it's irresponsible for investigators, and I'll just leave it sort of at that. Investigators, whether it's law enforcement or prosecution investigators or whomever it is, because it makes a difference to families who their loved one died while in need of medical care, and it was from natural reasons or a result of their original condition versus they were killed.
I totally agree.
Okay, and so it's irresponsible to allow someone to plead guilty and be adjudicated guilty to a bunch of deaths that had no indication that they were homicides until that point.
I don't disagree with you. And I don't know how to fix that particular thing. It is a fascinating part of this.
But it is very important to keep that in mind. And like you said, there's lawsuits happening for people that had died that they could somehow link to him. And, there's a whole thing happening there where it cost a lot of people a lot of heartache, a lot of energy and effort and money.
Yep.
And it's sort of like, good for the journalist for getting his awards.
Are you mad at the journalist here?
No, I'm not, except I hope that they did their due diligence, but to me, due diligence would suggest that in 2024, which is where we are right now, I couldn't have brought up these very relevant questions and had not been completely, knocked down for being incorrect.
Well, I've seen dribs and drabs that there were totems involved. There's some references to the occult, and honestly, there was a period of time where anytime somebody brought up the occult, I just assumed that like they had no idea what they were talking about related to the crimes. But apparently, here there were some things he said that made them think that. I don't have a lot more on him, and this case honestly infuriates me. Let me ask you this: is there any way to go back through and verify this?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either. I can't figure it out.
I have no idea. I mean, if you were to tell me that that all these bodies were re-examined and there was evidence that indicated that actually the bodies don't even have to be re-examined. If there's any indication at the point of which they died that there is suspicion of whatever. But see, I don't think that's going to be the case because, homicides are almost always autopsied.
Yeah, this is, like I said, it's a unique set of circumstances because of the location of most of these alleged homicides and accidental deaths that he is, responsible for. They do, they hit him with some charges in here related to like manslaughter. Not every case is just a flat out first degree murder.
I feel like it would have been expensive and time consuming, but a trial would have required some more corroboration.
Yeah, there is some investigation that you can see. Okay, remember how you said people are overworked, there's a lot of people involved, and you kind of looked at some of the early angel of death cases that we talked about in these, this little time period that we're talking. And you were like, there's a lot of people that sort of should have had eyes on these things.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know that the law enforcement investigation was any better. Because if you suddenly have 50 homicides to look at, even if 10 of them are in another jurisdiction, but you have the suspect, that's a lot.
I don't see where law enforcement did that investigation.
Well, that's why
I see that it's like a news story.
That's kind of how
And
all
then
of
it
it.
was a confession. It was a news story with a journalist and a defense attorney collaborating with the prosecution to come up with a plea agreement.
Yeah, and so to put an end to all of this, on March 28th, 2017, authorities reported that Donald Harvey had been found in his cell severely beaten. And on March 30th, 2017, he died. May 3rd, 2019, 2 years later, James Elliott, who was an inmate in the same facility, was charged with aggravated murder and other charges related to the death of Donald Harvey. And in September of 2019, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison after pleading guilty to killing Donald. That sentence was originally ordered to run consecutively to his other sentences, but was later changed to run concurrently. James Elliott would have become eligible for parole in 2046 when he would have been 71 years old. This is new for me because I've never seen where I thought for sure I would run across a couple of haphazard autopsies that maybe weren't perfect. There were some young people that died early on, like the third and fourth victims were like in their 40s. Couldn't find them. Didn't find
Don't you
it.
think that? Doesn't it seem there that I don't know what it was, but it just seems to me like he was recounting everybody that had ever died.
Well, I looked at it from that perspective. I didn't find a great investigation here. I kind of understand some of it, but what I really was thinking, I was genuinely thinking, was that they would have at least exhumed, say, 5 of the suffocations or 5 of the like poisonings and gone, all right, we're on the right track. I don't see it looking like that, and I can't figure out where the real failure is in all of this.
The failure is telling them that if he confessed to more murders, he would not get sentenced to death.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening today. We'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
All right, so I'm going to tell you guys a few things about some of the folks who are helping sponsor our show. Now, Labrati Creations sponsors our show, and you can always use the Crime XS code there. You can also just message them at Labrati Creations, and they will generally do something for the people who come from True Crime XS. They were our very first sponsor. They've done a lot for the show, and that code is CrimeXS at LabratiCreations.com. The first new advertisers that we have, and I've selected all of these guys. I've selected all of these advertisers. So the very first one is Cure. Now, I'm going to tell you guys about this, about Cure as being one of our sponsors. If you're an athlete, you know that proper hydration is key to peak performance, but plain water can be boring and sports drinks can be filled with artificial ingredients and added sugars. That's why we love Cure. It's a clean and effective way to stay hydrated and perform at your best. I use it late in the day when I switch out of caffeine mode. Specifically, when I hit the pool or I go play tennis with my wife, I use Cure to help me stay hydrated. It helps me recover after a long day. Now, you guys may not know this, but I build things. And right now, I've been building several structures on our property out here. Among those is a new podcast studio space for myself. I do a lot of that work at night and into the wee hours, and I always have some Cure with me to go into my aluminum water bottle. Hydration is not just about filling up my aluminum bottle with water. Cure Hydration is an oral rehydration solution that contains the perfect balance of electrolytes and glucose to help your body absorb water and rehydrate quickly. Whether I'm building things or putting the podcast together or chasing these dogs that you sometimes hear in my studio up and down the trails to get them worn out, Cure Hydration is the way that I choose to go. Cure Hydration is an oral rehydration solution, or an ORS, that contains the perfect balance of electrolytes and glucose to help your body absorb water and to rehydrate quickly. The formula is made with all natural ingredients like coconut water powder and pink Himalayan salt. It's free from artificial flavors, from sweeteners, and preservatives. Pure Hydration is vegan, gluten-free, and non-GMO, making it a great option for anyone with dietary restrictions or preferences. The packets are convenient and easy to use. You just mix them with your water and you drink. They're perfect for on the go. They're perfect for travel. And anytime you need a quick and effective hydration boost, ready to combat dehydration, then you try Cure today and feel the difference for yourself. You can use code TrueCrimeXS for 20% off your order. That's TrueCrimeXS. I have a link that I'm putting in the most recent episode show notes, and TrueCrimeXS will get you 20% off. Our second sponsor for the show today is Laird. Now, Laird has a list of things that they want me to tell you about. They have better ingredients with amazing taste and functional benefits. They have a superfood creamer crafted from the highest quality, all-natural, real food ingredients. All Laird products are sustainably sourced and thoroughly tested to ensure that you're incorporating the cleanest, finest fuel into your routine. They have all natural, whole food ingredients, and they contain naturally occurring MCTs made from coconut oil. There's no artificial flavors, there's no colors or additives, and there's no sugar from highly refined corn syrup. They want me to talk about my love of coffee, but the truth is, I don't do much with coffee. But let me tell you someone who does. My wife has to have a cup of coffee every day. Now, I've fallen off recently, but one of the big things that I've done since the beginning of our relationship is she used to go and get a Starbucks every morning. I have substituted that out by always trying to make her coffee. It's not going to be every single day of time from when I met her, but for the most part, almost every day, I make her coffee. I put her creamers together and I make sure that she has a good way to start her day. So with Laird, he started experimenting with his morning ritual almost 2 decades ago. He found that when he started adding fats to his morning cup, like coconut oil, he had amazing energy throughout the rest of his day. He gradually perfected this recipe for an epic cup of fuel, and he began sharing it with his friends in the surf community. I'm an ocean guy, so I saw this item and I was like, okay, we're going to try this one out. Are you ready to feel more energized, more focused, and supported? Go to lairdsuperfood.com and add nourishing plant-based foods to fuel you from sunrise to sunset. And you can use our promo code at checkout to save 15% off your purchase today. Our offer code for this for Laird is going to be TrueCrimeXS. Pretty much everywhere except for Labarde Creations, if you use TrueCrimeXS, that will get you, at Laird, it'll get you 15% off. At some of the other places, they'll get you 20% off. And the last sponsor I want to tell you about is Zencastr. We are part of Zencastr's creative network. We've been using Zencastr since about midway into our first season. Meg and I experimented with a lot of different ways to put the podcast together. And the truth is, Zencastr was an integral ingredient to us being able to bring you this show. It's so easy. It's now super easy. You can record a podcast with Zencastr. You can log in using your browser and you start recording a high quality podcast right away. You can record studio quality sound and up to 4K video with your guest. You get to feel a sense of zen, knowing that Zencastr's multi-layered backups ensure you will always have your recordings in the highest quality, even if the connection is unstable. You sound your best. I mean, if you've ever worried about what you sound like, Zencastr's post-production process makes you sound buttery smooth. It automatically removes those ums and ahs in your recordings. It removes those awkward pauses in conversation too. You can set the right podcast loudness and levels while reducing background noise with a click of a button. That's how you don't hear my dogs every second of every episode. Zencastr is all in one. If you've thought about podcasting before and realized that you need a lot of different tools and services, those days are now over. With Zencastr's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create your podcast all in one place, and you can distribute to Spotify, Apple, and other major destinations. Just go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my code TrueCrimeXS, and you're going to get 30% off your first month of any Zencastr paid plan. You can also check out the other plans they have available. I want you to have the same easy experiences that I do for all my podcasting and content needs. So Zencastr.com/pricing. The offer code is TrueCrimeXS, and it's time for you to share your story today. We are also adding New Era as a sponsor for the show. New Era Cap is a headwear and apparel brand founded in 1920 in Buffalo, New York. Now, I actually have some experience with New Era caps. My dad and I have been through multiple iterations of baseball caps through the years. We collect different styles, different eras, and now my teenager has started his own cap collection and has several New Eras as the centerpieces. Our favorite teams may not be the same, but our outfits are all topped with the same New Era ball caps. We love the quality and the ability to wear what the players are wearing. Not to mention, New Era is the leading headwear manufacturer with quality licensed products. You can support your favorite college or pro team in style from the official headwear provider for the MLB, NFL, and NBA. You can get a stylish accessory for your everyday ensemble and support True Crime XS. Just shop the official headwear and get 15% off when you go to neweracap.com. That's neweracap.com/TrueCrimeXS. You can also use the code TrueCrimeXS at checkout. That's it. That's all you have to do. And that's 15% off your order using the promo code TrueCrimeXS.